So in this section, we're now going to be breaking that step diagram, that flow chart, up into individual pieces and troubleshooting each section. Now let me pause here for a moment. If you're watching the recorded videos, which I presume you are, I would recommend that you stop this video. If you haven't already done so, go back to the previous one and do a screenshot of that flow chart. Because I'm going to be referring back to at step 1, at step 3, at step 1 we did this, at step 5 we did this. So it'll be helpful for you to have that entire picture in front of you to refer back to as I go along here. So now in this one, we're going to start with step 1 of the flow chart. So in step 1, I had to get into the default gateway in the first place to be able to issue my troubleshooting commands. And unfortunately, I was locked out. Couldn't get into the default gateway. Now I'm going to make some assumptions here. Assumption number 1 is that you are the network administrator. Nobody should be touching this equipment but you. There's nobody else who's authorized to have access to this router to change it, modify it. You are the only person allowed to do that. Number 2, I'm assuming you have the correct login and credentials. In other words, you've got a piece of paper or an email or maybe stored away in a database somewhere, all the current usernames and passwords to get into your routers and switches. Okay, so nobody should be updating those passwords without your approval. You should have the latest and greatest information. Last assumption, I'm assuming you have not made any changes in the last several weeks. So, you've been sitting, watching YouTube or whatever for the last several weeks. Everything's been chugging along fine, and you haven't needed to make any configuration changes to anything. So you're in control. You know the passwords to everything. You haven't changed anything. So those are the assumptions I'm going to make here. All of a sudden, blam, you can't get into this router that you control and you should know the password to. Maybe you're trying to log in and you're typing in the password and keep saying, wrong. Okay, interesting. Well, if password recovery, so in this particular case, your only choice at this point is to do password recovery. So just, whatever the model of router is, just look at the front of it, 1841, 75, whatever. Go onto Cisco's website or Google Cisco 1841 password recovery. If you don't know what the procedure is, find the document for that and then do a password recovery. Now here's the interesting question though. Why is it not accepting your password? I mean, after all, you're the only one who's supposed to be in control of this router. You haven't changed the password as far as you know. What's going on here? Well, and then the other thing is, okay, we'll actually come back to that. The other thing is the console being completely unresponsive, which requires a power cycle. So let's look at that first. Let's look at the one on the right first. Console is completely unresponsive. You've attached a console connection. You're typing something, you see nothing. Nothing you can do can give you access to the console. In this case, your only option is to power cycle the router. I mean, if you can't get into the command line, you're stuck. You've got to power cycle it. So let's take a step back. Why might that happen? Why might the router become completely and utterly unresponsive to the console? Well, usually the fundamental reason, the initial cause, is because the CPU of the router, remember, when you initiate a console connection, the CPU is told of that, right? The CPU says, okay, I've just seen a character come in the console port. I've seen some electrical connectivity, which corresponds to a certain character, which tells me someone wants to control me on the console. So now the CPU says, okay, I need to respond back with some kind of a prompt. So you're getting the CPU involved, the central processing unit. Well, usually if you don't get anything on the console, it's because the CPU is maxed out. It's at 99 or 100%, and it just cannot process anything. It can't give you any commands. It can't respond to your console request because it's just fried. It's just so busy. Now that shouldn't happen. The CPU should never get so high that it can't give you command line access. So Just off the top of my head, I came up with 3 potential reasons as to why that might happen. So number 1, could be a bug, right? There could be a bug that just causes CPU to max out, and, well, you'll just have to identify that bug. Number 2, it could be an intentional attack. There could be a denial of service attack going on right now on your router, and someone's sending that router some information so much and so frequently that the CPU is just dying, trying to respond to all that. Or number 3, maybe you're at fault. Maybe you were just on this router a little while ago and you turned on some kind of a debug that you weren't supposed to turn on. For example, Cisco's got an interesting little debug. I have no idea why they created this, but if you do debug question mark, for example, I'll bring this up here. So let me just make this a little bit bigger for you so you can see it. Okay, so I get into a router here. Okay, debug question mark. Look at this nice little one. Debug all. Enable all debugging. Why in the world did Cisco create that? I don't know, but here's what's happening if you turn that on. Don't turn it on, whatever you do, or you're going to be working at the donut shop tomorrow. So here's what happens. Whenever you turn on a debug, what's really happening under the hood is you're basically telling the processor, you're saying, look, stuff that you do that's invisible to me, that I don't normally see, send it to the console. So whenever you make a change or whenever a trigger or event happens, I want you to send some sort of text to the console port telling me about that. Well, there's some things that go on in the router that happen so fast, that changes and stuff are happening so quickly, that if you debug that, the CPU will become overwhelmed trying to tell you what's happening and go kaput and freeze. Debug all would be an example of that. If you turn on every single debug with debug all, I can virtually guarantee you that you are going to freeze out your console access on your router because it just will be trying to process so much stuff, it'll die. So don't do that. And there's other debugs as well. There's other debugs in here that you really want to be careful of turning on because it could end up locking you out of your router. Now let's go back to the DOS attack. Let's say there's a denial of service attack going on right now. Well, if that denial of service attack has been successful and knocked the CPU all the way up to 99 or 100% where you can't get out, okay, well, like it shows you here, the only option is to power cycle it. Now, if you power cycle it and it comes back on, if that denial of service attack is still happening right now, probably within, a few seconds, maybe a minute, you're going to be locked out again. So you've got a very short window of time to identify that denial of service attack and figure out where it's coming from and what to do about it. So what are some things that you could do? Okay. By the way, if it was a software error, show version will show you why a router reloaded, for example. In this particular case, it says a software forced crash. So maybe that software is what, that crash, that error, is what froze the router for a period of time, and then it crashed it, and it came back up. So this is sort of like a little historical artifact to tell you that the last time the router reloaded was because it crashed. And you'll have to go down the road of debugging what the issue was, what the bug was. So detecting denial of service attacks. Show processes CPU sorted. This is a nice command. Now, this router I'm on here really isn't doing much of anything. But if I do that command, show proc CPU sorted, it actually sorts all the processes from those that are using the most amount of CPU to those that are using the least. So if there's some denial of service attack happening, or if there's some other feature or protocol that's misbehaving in this router and causing the CPU to be overwhelmed, after you power cycle it, after you reload it, if you start doing this command immediately, every couple of seconds, hopefully the offending process will show up at the very top of this list, and you'll see it climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing, and you'll know what it was. Now let's say the process is, there's a process in here called the IP input process. So whenever an IP packet comes in that has to be forwarded to the CPU to be looked up, it's the IP input process that will be invoked and look up that packet. So maybe our next question is, where are these packets coming from? You know, I want to shut down the interface where this attack is coming from. Well, you can do show interface stats. Now in this particular case, I've only got a couple of interfaces, but what you're looking for is, ideally when packets come in, they're going to hit the route cache. They're not going to hit the processor. If a whole slew of packets are coming in, you know, tens of thousands of packets every single second, and they're going to the processor, that could very well be indicative of a denial of service attack. So if I see, for example, if I keep doing this command over and over again, and on one particular interface, maybe this one, I see packets in is just increasing like crazy, I'll say, okay, that's a pretty good indicator that my denial of service attack is coming from this interface. Let me shut that interface down real quick, and then I can do some further investigation. So if the router is completely locked out and you had to power cycle it, it's probably one of those three things. A bug, which you might be able to see from show version here if it ever crashed the router. A denial of a service attack, like we just talked about, or you turned on a debug that was not advisable to turn on. Now let's say you can get into it, but it says you're typing in the wrong password. You say, wait a second, I'm in control of this router. I know what the last password was I put on here. How can it be telling me the password is wrong? Well, two basic things could cause this. A change in the running configuration file, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, or a change in the AAA server that wasn't communicated. Now, what's that second bullet point talking about? Frequently in larger networks that have, you know, dozens or hundreds of routers and switches, the way the network will be set up is they'll go onto each router and switch and they'll say, okay, instead of giving you the username and password right there on this router switch, if someone ever tries to get into you, if someone ever tries to connect to you via telnet or via the console port, first, I want you to gather their credentials, whatever they're typing, their username and password, and then go to this external server I've got sitting over here and verify the credentials. Because that way, by doing that, if I ever want to change the login credentials, I don't have to go to every single router switch individually and do it. I can just go on one box, the AAA server, and change the credentials right there. And now whenever someone tries to connect, they'll have to know the new change credentials. So that could be the problem. Maybe you're in control of this router, but you're not in control of the AAA server. Somebody else is in control of that. And they made a change in that server without telling you. So your username and password file is not up to date because there was a miscommunication between the two of you. That's a possibility. Okay, so let's say something changed in the configuration file. So the username and password is supposed to be right here on the router locally, but it's not responding to what you're typing in. So you do a password recovery. Next question you have to ask yourself is, did somebody change the configuration? Did somebody hack into this? Well, one way to detect that is to do this, directory all. So basically directory is saying, show me the memory locations. For example, if I go in here, I can say directory and then specify a memory location like flash. Show me what's in flash memory. And it shows me I've got this Cisco iOS and some other files. Directory NVRAM. Show me what's in NVRAM, and that's where your startup config is. I could do directory /all, or actually directory without the slash, directory all, and that shows me every single memory system. System, something called tempsys, and I can just scroll through here. But what I'm looking for is if somebody changed the configuration file, the running config, but they didn't save it, there's a discrepancy between the running config and the saved or the startup config. They shouldn't be the same size. So I can use that command, directory all, and then I can pipe it to include running-config, the pipe startup-config. So instead of seeing all of this stuff, it'll narrow it down. I can say, wait a second. The running config and the startup config are supposed to be exactly identical. The last time I left this router, I know I saved the file. They should be the same. But clearly, they're not. This tells me somebody else got into this router and changed the config because these two things are not the same. Now, what could cause that? Well, if you were the one who made the last change, but you forgot to save it. Maybe it wasn't, maybe you got called away to an emergency meeting or something, but for whatever reason, you changed the username and password and you had to run away real quick and you forgot to save it. And then all of a sudden, there's a power outage or somebody trips over the cable or something. Basically what happens is the router loses power. Well, guess what? When it comes back up, it's going to go back to its startup config, which is different because you never bothered to save the running config. There could be a benign hack. What do I mean by a benign hack? That means that somebody without proper training or authorization logged into the router or switch, attempted to configure it, and screwed it up. Now, maybe it's not malicious. In other words, maybe you're training somebody, or maybe, maybe you're training a network admin who's going to take up the reins when you leave, and they got into it. They tried to do something good, but they just forgot a command, they forgot an option, whatever, and they messed it up. And they didn't ask you to get into it, right? You said, hey, if you ever want to get into this, let me know first. Well, they didn't let you know first. That's what I would call a benign hack, right? Somebody who got in without the appropriate permissions. A malicious hack, I think you can guess what that is, right? That's somebody who intentionally hacked their way into this device with the intention to cause you harm or mischief. That's a malicious attack. So, for a basic networking troubleshooting, that's where we're going to stop right now with the fact of I was trying to get into the default gateway and I couldn't. It was either frozen or the password was wrong. So now we've looked at identifying those possible causes and what we could do about it.